Thank you so much, Jerome. That's beautiful. That's all right. Thanks. So yeah, when you don't have a talk prepared, you are required to speak from the heart, right? You are required to talk about what is deeply alive for you. So what I want to share about today are two ideas that have been very alive for me. The first is this concept of flow, of being in the flow of life. And the second is the practice of forgiveness, which has been deeply alive for me in the past several weeks. I want to begin by speaking a little bit about Taoism. Now, many of you have already likely heard about Taoism, spelled Taoism. For me, Taoism kind of creates a foundation for my forgiveness practice. Taoism is a spiritual and philosophical tradition that originated in China in 6th century BC, grounded primarily in the teachings of a man named Lao Tse. And the idea behind it is this concept of living in flow with what is known as the Tao. But as you study it, particularly from this Western-educated mind, you hear that, well, you're like, what is the Tao, you ask? And they answer, well, the Tao cannot be explained. And we're like, great, that helps, right? The Tao cannot be explained. And in fact, there's a core teaching of the Tao that says the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao. And again, for our Western mind, sort of like, okay, that doesn't explain it. But if I sit there for a moment, the Tao that cannot be spoken, that can be spoken is not the true Tao, I can sit and have an experience of something back of those words. So when people try to point at this principle known as the Tao, they describe it as this principle that is the very substance, the very source that is behind every single thing that exists. And when I heard this, I said, wow, Unity co-founder Charles Fillmore defines God, often in his text, as the pure principle back of all of life. The invisible source that is behind all things. So amazing how this ancient Eastern tradition really matches up with what we teach here as the foundation for who we are and why we come together, the very fabric of all of life. One of the things I've noticed is when I think about this concept of being in flow, is that I would actually be lying to you if I told you that I was surprised when I was called to speak today. Because interestingly enough, this Sunday was, to my intellect, the one Sunday, after many, many Sundays of speaking every single Sunday at our Unite service at 12:15, this was going to be the one Sunday when I wasn't going to speak. That was what I had planned. And I had Reverend Robert Brummett planned to speak at Unite for me. But last night, Robert Brummett texted me at about 9 p.m. and said he was feeling ill. and that he wasn't sure, but I might need to speak tomorrow. And so what's funny is in that moment, I thought, oh, okay, well, do I really want to start working on something tonight, or am I going to just kind of trust this flow of life and everything, and just kind of be with this? And he said, I think I'll be well by 12:15, but I just wanted to let you know, and I'll tell you first thing in the morning. And so I sat with it, and I decided not to prepare for today. Just, trusting that flow, right? This morning, I was actually surprised when Robert texted me and said, I'm good to go. Woo, I'm good to go, so Nhien, you don't have to do the talk. This is 7 a.m. And then at 8:30, I get a call from Duke. And Duke is coughing like this, I think really exaggerating these emotions, I think. But he tells me, I'm sick, and I really did say, really? Are you sure? And so he convinced me. But I sat in that moment, and I remember the night before, there was something in me that said, Nhien, you will be speaking tomorrow. There's something in me that just knows that kind of thing. There are things that are just known now. So I want to talk about how through spiritual practice, we start to just know more things. And we do live in this flow of life, but it's God's flow, it's not mine, clearly, right? We set our calendar in such a way, but there is like a universal calendar that tells us where we're called to be and what we're called to do. So I'm going to invite this idea to just sit and percolate for a while. And then I want to introduce, again, why Taoism is so important to my practice foundationally. I want to share a story that comes from the Taoist tradition that is related to forgiveness. So there is a sage and his one disciple who meets every day for a lesson. And one day, the disciple comes to the sage, and the sage had brought two things to their session. The sage brought an empty big sack, and the sage also brought a huge cart of potatoes that were kind of pretty ripe potatoes. And so he goes to his disciple and he says, so your assignment is that for this week, you're going to carve on each potato the name of every single person, of each person, one per potato, against whom you feel ill will or unforgiveness. And so the very dutiful disciple proceeds to do this. And so he carves on one potato, and the potatoes start to build up after a while. And then the master, the teacher, says, okay, so once you have these, put them all in the sack, and I want you to carry this sack around every single place you go, everywhere you go this week. Now, this disciple is really used to chores. So he's like, I'm pretty buff, right? I can handle this. And it's not that many potatoes. So he picks up the bag. First day, he lugs it over his shoulders, like, this is not so bad, day one. The second day, though, he notices, hey, I haven't added any more potatoes to this bag, but it feels heavier today, right? Second day, the bag, same weight, is starting to feel heavier. And then not only that, he realizes as he's trying to navigate life and do things, the bag kind of gets in his way. So it gets in his way, it's getting extra heavy. Then, to top it off, by day 4, these ripe potatoes are starting to stink, right? So he's carrying around a bag of stinky potatoes, walking around, and people are going, what's that? So stinky potatoes. And so he does this, and by day 5, day 6, he's like, I can't wait to go back at the end of this week and confer with my master. So at the end of the week, he happily comes back, drops the bag of potatoes down, and the master says, so? And the student ponders this. He's one of, the best students out there, and says, well, failing to forgive is like carrying around this sack of potatoes every day. It starts to weigh on you, and then after a while, it starts to stink, right? And the master said, yeah, right. And so, what is one to do? And the student thinks about it and says, well, we effort to forgive everyone. And the master nods his head and says, yes, Exactly. And so you, sitting here today, you, my student, he says, which potatoes are you willing to forgive? Are you willing to forgive a few, a handful, all of them? And the overachieving student enthusiastically says, you know, I've been carrying these around all week and very conscious of it. And I've been reflecting on this, Master. I feel that I am willing to forgive them all. And he was so excited about this, and the Master was elated and says, great, my student. You can now start taking one potato at a time out. Start removing those potatoes. And the student is elated, and he's removing the potatoes from this sack of his. But then as the student is doing this, the Master says, hold on a minute. During the last week, did anyone do anything against you? And the student said, yes. Of course, people did things to upset me. And the student then backs off. He knows what the Master is about to say. He's like, no. What is the point of the Tao? What is the point of learning all this if I have to pile up potatoes again every single week in my sack and lug them around, he says, out of desperation. And the Master replied, you know, we have not even begun to talk about the realm of the Tao here. What you and I have been talking about is simply the realm of conventional forgiveness. In conventional forgiveness, there is a striving to forgive. There is an effort to forgive. And this effort is very virtuous and important. But in the Tao, there is no effort. And the student paused. He didn't understand at first. But then the Master prodded and asked him, so, now if your negativity this week were these potatoes, he said. If your negativity were these potatoes, what's the sack? And then the student realized, the sack is what I used to carry around all this animosity and ill will and negativity. The sack is my inflated sense of self. And so, yes, the practice of forgiveness, as this Master taught, entails the fact that from our human experience, once we have already picked up a potato, right, that there's a process of unloading the potatoes through what is known as conventional forgiveness. But there is also a deeper practice of addressing our connection with the sack itself. In both Taoism and Buddhism, one might say that this sack is the self that is illusory, right? We're not often as aware, though, that within the unity and mystical Christian tradition, there is this similar concept that the self, the ego with which we are normally identified, is actually not our true self. On the topic of ego and self, I can't help but share a story shared with me by Reverend Robert Brummett. I thought it was a pretty funny story related to Buddhism that says, you know, at one of these modern, maybe New Agey Buddhist retreats, a woman came up to the teacher and asked, "Do you think that Buddhism could help me with my low self-esteem?" And that teacher nodded and said, "Yes, indeed. And it can also help with your high self-esteem, too." That it's not about low self-esteem or high self-esteem, but it's about whether what we're identified with in the first place is true or is false. So I'm going to bring back these two principles and talk today about how the process of forgiveness helps us be in the true flow of life. The process of forgiveness, but what I might call true forgiveness. True forgiveness wakes us up to the truth of what we are, which is unassailable, right? Which is not that self that can sometimes feel lower than others. When someone criticizes me, when someone attacks me in some way, or that wants to pump myself up, right? Even with moral righteousness that says, "Oh, I'm a forgiving person, so I'm better than you," right? So to not go either way, but to stand in something deeper and more foundational that is the very truth of being, and that the more and more that we reclaim this true identity within us, the more we begin to know things about ourselves and lives, and the more we begin to actually live and let ourselves surrender to this ease and flow that is the beneficence of life. So true forgiveness, what is it to me personally? Because I don't want to claim to know true forgiveness for everyone. True forgiveness for me is rooted in the principles of A Course in Miracles. You know, we have a Monday night class that meets and explores the principles here. And A Course in Miracles for me is a deep Christian tradition, but that is rooted in this non-dual Christianity, which is what we in Unity claim, right? The Course's opening says this: nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. And herein lies the peace of God. When I first read those words, like my body vibrated. You know how sometimes you read something that there's a sense of recognition deep inside? That it's like, that's this ultimate truth. Who I am in truth is unassailable. It can't be hurt by you. And if I know that, I'm not going to walk around being a victim of you, being wounded by you. At the same time, let's take a step back and be realistic. The reason I shared that this is alive for me is that for the past 2.5 and 3 weeks, I found that I was walking around upset at everybody. You know, you have those phases, like suddenly things that didn't bother me were bothering me. And it seemed like everyone was annoying me, everyone was getting in my way, everyone was irritating me. But the difference is, in the past, I might have been like, yeah, people are lame, you know, like, I mean, I might have really thought, like, the world, this is just how the world is, and I just have to deal with it or work around it, or use my powers to kind of get what I think I need. But instead, this feeling of unease, I could tell now, when I start to feel that way, what do I know? I know that I'm not grounded in a deep truth. Because if I'm in the flow of life, there is absolutely nothing in my way. There is no one in my way. If I'm centered in the truth that there is only one power and one presence, there is no one in opposition to me. So it's not their problem, it's my problem of lack of being steeped in the truth that I know. So I wandered around for several weeks, kind of smiling on the outside, but really kind of irritated at you on the inside, you know, but still aware of this, and trying to feel back into myself for what was missing. And it reminded me of how, you know, sometimes we can teach all these things and be like, oh yeah, just forgive. It reminded me of how difficult it can be to forgive others. You know, Stanford University professor, the head of the Stanford Forgiveness Project, Frederick Luskin, talked about the numerous benefits. You know, Duke talks here a lot about this well-being, the numerous benefits of forgiveness. It's good for your heart, it's good for longevity, it's good for prosperity, it's good for prayer. A lot of times when we teach prayer, we teach that a lot of times when you feel like your prayer is not answered, look inside and see if there's a place to forgive. That there's so many benefits. And he's like, well, why don't people do it more then, right? If there's so many benefits, why don't people do it more? Well, he cited that there are a couple misconceptions about it. One of them is that even though I know this intellectually isn't true, I still fall into the trap of thinking, if I forgive you, what you just did, that was horrifying, right? That I'm condoning your behavior, right? So he invited us to get out of this trap of believing that forgiveness means you're condoning that person's behavior. And he also wants to disabuse us of the notion that forgiveness requires that we live in harmony with this person. I mean, someone's physically abusing you or emotionally abusing you. Forgiveness is a process of reclaiming your truth in your own heart and mind. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to stay with this person in proximity or in relationship. But we're kind of, something about our conventional way of looking makes us have to feel like, oh, well, if this is a family member especially, it means, you know, for me to be love in the world, I have to make sure we're friends and we're good and we're okay. And so we lapse into that and get locked into that. So some of the fallacies. The biggest one that he cited that I love is that we don't have to forget. That saying, you know, like that to forgive you must also forget. And I'm like, that's the weirdest thing ever, because I don't have selective memory, you know, in that way. Why would I just take out a piece of what just happened to me here out of my memory? It doesn't make sense that I would need to forget. So those three pieces, he said, were core to realizing that that is not what forgiveness needs to be. Though there are times when, through forgiveness, we might heal in our relationship to others. The deeper, more foundational practice of true forgiveness, which is taught by Charles Fillmore and A Course in Miracles, is that forgiveness is simply the surrendering of the false for the true. The surrendering of the false self for the true. Because if we have something against our brother or our sister, we know that we are not seeing the truth of the divinity of their being. And if we are feeling victimized by our brother and our sister, then we are not knowing that in truth, my wholeness, my lovability, my perfection is unassailable, cannot be impacted by how you treat me. I have to know that deeper than anything. But when I know that, something magical seems to happen. So I want to share about that process. So first, we might recognize that even that forgiveness is not really about something we should do, like how in traditional church it's like, to be a good person, forgive, you know, but rather it's about recognizing that there is an inherent sense of well-being and peace that arises for us only when we remember who we really are and only when we remember who the other person in front of us really is, a child of God, perfect and whole, divine in essence, if not always in the manifest, but divine in essence. And every time we break that knowing within our own hearts, we disconnect ourselves from the truth of being, and that is the real loss of unforgiveness in us. And so the practices that have supported me deeply include that mantra from A Course in Miracles. So what I started to do, humbled by the fact that here I am, a minister, and it was like 2.5, 3 weeks before I really even became willing to look at the fact that I was so grouchy at everybody, But when I was finally able to do that, I sat in, and I remember Charles Fillmore once declared radically that you could cure yourself of every ailment if you would only sit for a half hour every night and forgive everyone you can think of. I remember that. I'm like, oh. But I did. I sat down and started this practice again of just allowing these names to move forward and like emptying the basket, being willing to let go, being willing to remember my truth, being willing to remember your truth. And that process has been very uplifting for me. There is a teaching that I want to leave you with. I've shared a lot of different ideas. I want to review it really quickly to just begin by saying that I believe that each and every one of us has a capacity for living in a deep and profound sense of peace as an everyday movement of life. You feel this when you're living in flow. You don't have that instability and uncertainty because there is a part of you, even like when my ego's like, oh, I'm not gonna speak. You know how it is, and that knowing gives you a sense of depth and peace within your own soul. And you also know that in every moment you will be guided. Not necessarily guided in ways that support the ego. If I'm going to be, Spirit will give me what to say so that, my ego can be flattered and know that I've done a good job. That's not it. It's that Spirit will give me exactly what to say to live my highest truth and to support you in doing the same. That I know. And that capacity is always there and available for us. But what stops that? What starts to slow us down, make us listless and heavy and feel burdened and feel like things are just in our way is predominantly unforgiveness. But unforgiveness, the process of letting go of unforgiveness begins simply with willingness. Willingness to feel our hurt and our pain and the willingness to let it move through us and to let it go. But I want to close with a practice that has supported me on the spot that you can do right now, today. It's called Ho'oponopono. And there are just 4 lines to this prayer. But now, for spot treatment during the day, we can just simply practice this. Keep in heart and mind, as you hear what I'm about to say, that the prayer isn't really to the other person. It's the prayer of the highest self to the false self, the little self that doesn't know. And it's simply this. I apologize. Could you share that with me? Repeat that. I apologize. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. I apologize. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. So it is. Let's prepare now for a time of meditation.